one person on the media.
¿Estamos listos?
We got one person on the media. No.
Okay,
I would
just
tell you.
about. Having a buffering issue inside our beautiful new Facebook app, otherwise known as the Myth of Progress. All right.
Yep. You're good.
All right, as the kids say, welcome to this live stream hangout. My name is Patrick Coffin, co-founder of Coffin Nation, host of the Patrick Coffin Show. I'm Canadian-born. I live somewhere between Hollywood and Mexico. And every month we do a live stream, and we kind of open a window onto what we do inside Coffin Nation. And today we're going to talk about something extremely important for parents, medical professionals, anyone who's paying attention to the main news story, which is we're still on the tail end of the lockdown due to the global pandemic. But there's another pandemic going on, and that is the pandemic of suicide, anxiety, depression, caused by kids waking up and opening up their laptops for hours on end, the closing of schools, the shutting down of churches. It's built up a fund of psychic pain and anxiety and emotional problems. So to digest and dissect some of all this and come up with a plan of sanity and accuracy, I'm inviting our good friend, Dr. Kheriaty, to talk about the spike in suicide and depression. No one seems to want to cast light upon it, but that's what we'll do today. He's a professor, full professor now at University of California in Irvine, the director of the medical ethics program at UCI Health, Psychiatry and Human Behavior School of Medicine. He's also a regular contributor to First Things magazine. Check out First Things. Kheriaty, great writer, and so great to have you today. I know you're busy, so thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Patrick. Always good to be with you.
Sometimes the news will continually show shiny metal objects, and sometimes those shiny metal objects, when you look in the rearview mirror, they're more like distractions from the coming 18-wheeler. You and I have talked about on the podcast, Hope When Hope Seems Gone, and the crisis of meaning just in our culture. Talk a little bit at the beginning, if you could, of the people who were already on the edge, the people who were white-knuckling it. You know, that person, to cite one of your essays, walking toward the Golden Gate Bridge and no one smiles at him. Those people who were already, kind of staring at the abyss, hoping the abyss wasn't going to stare back. Those people are obviously in crisis, right? Maybe we can start there.
That's right. We're seeing another pandemic sort of running side by side with the pandemic that's getting all the attention, with the coronavirus. And that is a pandemic that's caused in part directly by the virus, but also in large part, maybe even larger part, not by the virus itself, but by our decisions in the face of the virus, the way in which we've collectively chosen to respond to the coronavirus pandemic has really adversely affected our mental health. And I just want to walk through some of the recent data that we have on that, some key studies that were just published a couple of weeks ago that confirm what a lot of us psychiatrists have been seeing in the clinic. So we saw this sort of tidal wave coming of more patients, of more people suffering from depression, anxiety, addictions, suicidal thinking, but we didn't have hard data on it until recently. And that data has confirmed, I think, what I and my colleagues are seeing in the clinic. If you do a casual poll of Americans, about half of them report that they believe the coronavirus crisis is harming their mental health. And, I believe, again, it's not just the virus, but it's a response to the virus that's created or at least exacerbated this problem. It's expanded the scope of the mental health problem, the magnitude, probably the duration that we're going to have to deal with this. So let me just start with a CDC report that was published almost a month ago now. Really devastating study. This is a population-based survey of about 5,000 Americans. Good methodology, randomly sampled, should be representative of Americans as a whole. Just without going down into all the weeds, some key findings. about 40% reported at least one problematic mental or behavioral health condition, with about a third of people reporting symptoms of an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, and about a quarter of the people reporting symptoms of a trauma or stress-related disorder. That would be something like PTSD.
Yes.
13% of Americans in this study reported increasing their use or misuse of substances to try to cope with the stress or the stressful emotions related to the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
And what's of most concern to me, 11% of Americans, 1 in 10, had seriously contemplated suicide in the past 30 days. So this study was done in June.
1 in 10?
During the 1 in 10, right? Not ever considered suicide in their entire life, but in the last 30 days, in the last month, had contemplated suicide. Even more sobering, Patrick, among young adults, the age bracket of 18 to 24-year-olds, 24%, a quarter of young adults, had seriously contemplated suicide during the month of June. I mean, that's just an astonishing number to me. You don't see these kinds of numbers in psychiatric epidemiology and in behavioral health. We don't yet have numbers on completed suicides. There's a year or two lag time on those. They're not easy numbers to come by or easy numbers to process. But we do know that we have high rates of suicidal ideation, which is going to correlate with high rates of completed suicides.
Just if I can press pause, the word ideation gets kind of tossed around by laymen. What's the good definition of suicidal ideation? Thinking about it, have planned about it. What's the metric on that?
Yeah. So I wish I could just go to sleep and not wake up in the morning. A kind of passive death wish is usually not characterized by psychiatrists as suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation would be active thoughts about how I might take steps to end my life, right? That would be things like coming up with a plan, going on the internet to search out some method, accessing the means that I might employ, purchasing a gun if I don't have one, things of that nature. So these are people who are not just thinking, gosh, I don't know if I could go on anymore, but I don't know if I can go on anymore. And I'm thinking about how I might go about ending my life.
So first steps of action taken based on that feeling of despair.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right. And also, interestingly, Blacks and Hispanics have lower rates of suicide and suicidal ideation as compared to the general population in the United States. But in this study, their rates surpassed the general population. So those ethnic minorities, Hispanics had 19% over the past month, Blacks 15% as compared to 11% overall.
Yeah.
Unpaid caregivers, a third of them had considered suicide, and essential workers, frontline workers, about 1 in 5. So there are certain populations where their stress seems to be exacerbated by the coronavirus crisis that are probably at even more risk than the general population.
Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
Just to give you a benchmark.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got one more thing, and then we can move on from this study. But okay, what do these numbers mean? Just to put it in a little bit of perspective, compared to June of the previous year, 2019, so a year-to-year comparison, the rates of anxiety disorders had tripled in 2020. Rates of depressive disorders had quadrupled. Okay, so what's normal? What's kind of the baseline benchmark? That gives you a sense of, compared to a year ago, this is where we're at today. Again, very sobering numbers. You don't see changes like that in psychiatric epidemiology year to year.
Wow. I knew it was bad. I didn't know that the numbers were that high. I mean, a third of caregivers. I mean, caregivers are it brings to mind the question, well, who's ministering to the ministers? Who's caring for the caregivers? Every third is an astounding figure. A recent guest on the Patrick Coffin Show I've learned a ton from is a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He wrote a book called On Killing, another book called On Combat. And he has a new book that I'm going to recommend everyone. It's called Assassination Nation. And he did an analysis of school shooters. And all of them have one thing in common: deeply wedded to video games, especially first-person singular angle games. And what Lieutenant Grossman says about the media is the media's responsibility in creating content that is inherently violent, that is propulsive, and now with VR, for these virtual reality environments, completely vivid. And young people are having more and more psychic breaks. They can't tell the difference between inside the game and outside in the clinician's office. What role do you think is played by media malfeasance and deliberately going for hitting the nerve, whether it's Netflix's show 13 Reasons Why, if you just go to pick on Drudge Report, something happened to Matt Drudge a year ago, and he's into, Orwellian upside down world. Every second headline is fear, trial, apocalyptic. So what's the media's role in all this? Because we've had pandemics before and involving diseases that were more deadly and even more contagious than COVID-19. What about the media role here?
It's a terrific question. I think the media's role is extremely significant, not only because the nature of what they're putting out there, which is clickbait, which is now, look, the nation is very divided right now. Okay, things are bad, but scrolling through social media can give you the sense that the apocalypse is near. I just ran across a piece in the Telegraph, the title of which was "Beware the Health Dangers of Doom Scrolling." So this is a new term that somebody out there has coined of people, glued to their social media. And it's not just the content, but it's the fact that if you're locked down at home and you're not going into work, you have a lot more time on your hands. You're not using that time to get out and go to the park and hang out with friends. Yeah, much more likely to be glued to your phone or your computer screen and scrolling through stuff that is designed to get your attention. Mm-hmm. And at least according to this piece, the caption is the effect of doom scrolling is equal to suffering blunt force trauma to the head. Okay, so there's kind of an assault on the senses and the imagination.
I thought you just said blunt force.
Too much of this stuff. Yeah, and look, it's very real. I speaking of social media, I tweeted out the other day, and this was picked up by a few people, that I am literally seeing people now from different sides of the political spectrum, people of different religious persuasions, who literally believe that the apocalypse is coming, and are telling me, I can't put my phone down because I can't miss anything. Yep. And look, these are not the patients that are manic or psychotic, that have a mental illness that causes them to lose touch with reality. We deal with that too. Mm-hmm. But those are not the people I'm talking about. I'm talking about otherwise healthy people, or people maybe with a mild depressive or anxiety disorder that are absolutely terrified now. And they realize that terror is coming from what they're seeing on TV. Mm-hmm. I asked one patient about this recently, like, if you were to do a media fast for a week, if you were just not to watch CNN, she was glued to CNN. If you were not to watch CNN for a week, what would happen? And her answer was, well, if the president gets assassinated, I won't hear about it if I'm not watching CNN. And I tried to reassure her that if the president is assassinated, I guarantee you will hear about it, even if you're not glued to CNN 24/7. Are you worried about the president being assassinated? In this particular case, her hope was that the president would be assassinated. So, people are glued to their screen for different reasons, I suppose.
So this is the FOMO principle, right? Fear of missing out. Maybe we need to coin a new one. FOMOD, right. Fear of missing out, more doom.
Right. So, we can sort of laugh about this, but this apocalyptic terror is real. I mean, it's impacting people in quite serious ways. I've never seen anything like it in, my almost 18 years of practicing psychiatry.
Well, you have Congresswoman Alexandria Occasional Cortisol saying with firm, solemn intonations, "We've got 12 years left." So, and this, she said this before the lockdown. So, boy, maybe it's going to be next Tuesday. I mean, I want to urge people to go to the Drudge Report and see what Matt Drudge is doing now to your brain. I always give him a wide berth now because I think it's dangerous to continually go to that pool of dog vomit of darkness, hopelessness. There's nothing you can do to control it. It's going to be a UFO landing. It's going to be what's the fear du jour? A giant rock hitting the earth, a tsunami, and now we have this pandemic. You and I are old enough to remember go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, this is since about the 70s, the media, I think, have focused on super scary things to sell things. And the first thing that comes to mind is actually the late 60s, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which came out the same month that the Pope Paul VI encyclical on contraception came out. And he was predicting by 2000, millions will perish. The population rate's exploding so quickly that we can't keep up with food production. Well, that's, it's called neo-Malthusianism. None of it came out to be true. But it got people excited and got them scared. Then you had the coming Ice Age in 1978. None other than Leonard Nimoy did the voiceover for a documentary, and it's serious. I mean, the Earth's getting colder and colder. We have a coming Ice Age. That didn't turn out to be true. Then you had the myth that everybody's going to get AIDS eventually. AIDS is like it's on every hiding behind every shrub. Then it's H1N1. Then it's Zika. It's Ebola. It's like a new fear. I got those pandemics a little bit out of order, but it seems like this current pandemic is the latest in a stream of fear products. Am I overplaying the card?
I don't think you are. I mean, this pandemic is serious, but at the same time, fear is a very good way to control people. If you have a population that's terrified, they're going to be looking to their leaders for guidance. That's what people do in a crisis, right? People look for someone who knows what to do because they feel out of their element, out of their comfort zone, out of their area of expertise. So a lot of the, we have to listen to the experts is a kind of, scientific feature of, our late liberal society, but it's also a natural reaction for people when they are scared with something novel to look to someone who seems like they know what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
To sort of fix it. So I think it's especially irresponsible for it's irresponsible for politicians at any time to inflate the scope of a problem, whether it's environmental catastrophe or a natural catastrophe, but especially during a pandemic when people are afraid and they don't know what's going to happen, they don't know what to do. Having a congresswoman say, we've got 12 years left is particularly irresponsible. And maybe she really believes that. Maybe she doesn't. I don't know. If she really does believe it, I think she probably needs a reality check. If she doesn't believe it, shame on her for terrifying already scared people with, this kind of talk. But you're right. We see these things, that the neo-Malthusian population scare in the 1970s, various other catastrophic, impending doom things. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, reading about environmental catastrophes that were only going to give us another 10 years, right? And here we are. And that's not to deny that there aren't serious problems with environment or perhaps climate change. I don't know, right? I'm not an expert in those areas. But the way in which these things are often framed is, unless we frame them catastrophically, people aren't going to do anything about them. To me, that's highly irresponsible. And I don't think people are fully aware of the effect that kind of thing can have on lots of ordinary people.
Right. If you've just joined us, this is a live stream hangout with Professor of Psychiatry at University of California, Irvine, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, also in private practice. Check out his fine essays in First Things Journal. I may have misspoke on the title of Lieutenant Dave Grossman's book. It's called Assassination Generation. The subtitle is Video Games, Aggression, and the Psychology of Killing. And now you've got a whole generation of, let's say, people under 20 or under 25, not going to school, afraid to go outside. This is their main source of distraction and entertainment. Which leads me to a question. I don't know if the study that you just cited with those jaw-dropping figures related to porn is. I understand that porn use is up. There's a company that was offering all kinds of freebies in Italy. Pornography as one more distraction from anxiety, depression, fear. Was porn use mentioned in that?
Yeah, so I haven't seen those numbers, but it doesn't surprise me at all that we would see an increase in pornography use. We're obviously seeing an increase in internet use in general, so it would stand to reason that those who utilize the internet for those purposes, or those who maybe didn't before, may be tempted to consume more pornography now. And we know that pornography gives you a kind of, especially for the male brain, there's a kind of dopamine spritz that happens. It hijacks the sexual arousal system in a way that many people have compared. I don't think this is a metaphor. I've compared it to a drug. We see pornography consumption behavior often becoming addictive because it gives you this little hit, but then it leaves you feeling sort of empty, increases your cravings and your restlessness until you get the next hit. It operates a lot like a substance of abuse. And when people are struggling with high rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, fear, they are going to be more prone to self-medicate those symptoms with something that can make me feel better right now, right? So we're seeing alcohol consumption go way up. We're seeing drug use go up. In probably a similar category, would not surprise me at all if we're also seeing pornography consumption going up during this period of time as well, because I think all of these things they'll tend to go hand in hand.
And with alcohol, you have to at least face a clerk. With drugs, you have to go to a dealer. But with porn, you're a couple clicks away from any kind of illegal, terrifying images. And if you don't have blocker, as I do, like all our devices have Covenant Eyes on them. By the way, if you go to covenanteyes.com, I just thought of this. Patrick, my name, gets you a free test drive for 30 days. If you don't, then you're a sitting duck. Porn companies put Disney character names with spelling errors, so kids will stumble onto it and get early addicts. Look at, since you've written very well and clearly also in First Things about the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why. Now you have softcore pedophilic grooming shows like Cuties being defended. If you go to the Rotten Tomatoes aggregate of ordinary humans who watch it and review it versus critics, I think it got 3 out of 100 for people who just watched it, and then 88 for the much smaller crew of critics. It's like every barrier of innocence, every layer of protection for children, it gets younger and younger each year. It's terrifying because it's happening in plain sight. They're no longer hiding it. There's no special part of town on the wrong side of the tracks for you to go. It's piped to you from your television or from your laptop.
That's right. I mean, the sexualization of children, which this film purported to critique, at least the story or the subtext of the film, that's the defense.
Yeah.
That its defenders have mounted. Some serious problems with that defense. The first problem being Netflix's marketing, right? Which clearly didn't give you that. If you look at the posters, if you look at the the screenshot captions that were utilized in the marketing of the film, they're entirely exploiting these child actresses. Not to mention the fact that the making of the film itself was exploitative. I mean, you can't have pre-adolescent girls dressed like that and twerking like that, I think is the word for that type of seductive kind of erotic dance, without in some sense abusing them. And it's like, well, gee, Netflix is making a movie. By the way, this is satire, this is sarcasm. They're not really doing this, but we're making a movie where the actresses actually eat a human being on set. But don't worry about the cannibalism, because if you watch the whole thing, the plot or the subtext will make it clear that this is anti-cannibalism. Well,
it's a social commentary on how bad it is.
That doesn't work, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, some things you can't undirtify it themselves, right? That makes sense. I got some questions here. By the way, Dr. Kheriaty is one of our presenters in our end of October virtual summit called Truth Over Fear. I'll tell you more about that as we go on. Okay, question here. Oh, someone else mentioned this is like Y2K on steroids. Remember Y2K? With the year 2000?
I remember Y2K, yeah. I was in college. I had a buddy who was doing some Y2K prep business that went bust immediately after the
around January 1st.
Exactly. So I mean, that turned out to be a nothing, right? And I don't want to suggest that the COVID pandemic has been a nothing, but my own opinion is that there are some serious problems now with the rationales that are being given for continued lockdowns. And, I can explain what I mean by that. The original rationale for the COVID lockdowns, if you remember, the strict social distancing, the stay at home, was to flatten the curve. The idea here was that we don't want to overwhelm hospitals too quickly with too many cases. We don't want people dying on the streets of coronavirus because they can't get a bed or they can't get a ventilator. And the implicit promise was, 3 to 5 weeks to allow hospitals to prepare. And I think most Americans bought into that promise and took a sort of altruistic stance. And we did flatten the curve. I was knee deep in preparing for worst case scenarios for a couple of months, starting in March. I was on the work group that prepared the University of California's ventilator triage allocation guidelines, right? So if we get too overwhelmed and we have to triage, how do we go about doing that? So I was thinking through disaster scenarios really 24/7, and we prepared. We expanded our surge capacity very significantly. All the hospitals did. And while things came close in New York City there for a couple of weeks, we didn't overwhelm the hospitals. We expanded enough. We managed the cases, and then we opened up a bit. And here in California, as you know, Patrick, the governor, after opening up, Governor Newsom reinstated severe lockdowns, right? After a brief period of time where things had relaxed for a bit. And I couldn't help but notice when he did that, I had the data on all the University of California hospitals. So these are hospitals scattered across the state, Northern Cal, Southern Cal. We were at anywhere between 10 and 20% ventilator capacity when the governor locked down. In other words, we were nowhere near our maximum surge capacity. And so why did he do this? And interestingly enough, the public messaging, the meme, was no longer flatten the curve. Nobody's talking about flattening the curve anymore. What we're getting now is we have to stay home in order to save lives. And to me, there's something dishonest about this. This is a kind of mendacious move. And the reason is distancing and staying at home does not stop the virus, does not cure anything. It
Mhm.
only slows the spread of the virus. So for the pandemic to actually end and for us to thereby save lives, we need herd immunity, and herd immunity can only be accomplished in two ways. Number one, a highly effective and safe vaccine, or number two, a sufficient proportion of the population that gets acquired natural immunity by getting infected with the virus.
Yep.
We need one of those two things, or we need some combination of those two things. Anything else is just dragging out the inevitable.
Mhm.
So the reason I think that the public messaging is now dishonest is that save lives really means we're going to stay locked down until we have an effective vaccine. But nobody's really saying that. Newsom hasn't said that. The mayor of LA actually admitted that. And I guess to his credit, he said we're going to stay locked down until there's a cure. But actually
Yeah.
coming out and saying that invites some pretty pointed questions, like
Right.
how long is it going to take to get a vaccine? And what if the 8 vaccines that are currently in clinical trials don't pan out? Or probably more likely, because I think we will get a vaccine probably before the end of the year. More likely, what if the vaccine is only partially effective? Uh,
Mhm.
people
Yeah.
people imagine the vaccine is going to be the magic bullet,
Mhm.
but actually, the FDA has set as its threshold for approving a COVID vaccine that it needs to be 50% more effective than placebo at preventing the disease, right? 50% more effective than placebo, not 100% effective. So roughly the efficacy of what we get from the annual flu vaccine, and people know how well that works. It's a hit
Not
and miss
100%.
kind of proposition. It's far from
Mm.
100%. Um, and and they're not even testing whether the vaccine can prevent transmission, only whether it can prevent me from getting really sick if I acquire the virus. So
Yeah.
there's no guarantee that the vaccine is going to slow transmission. There's no guarantee that an FDA approved vaccine is going to, make it safe for everyone to go out. We still may have to weigh the risks and benefits of lockdowns versus opening up and
Mhm.
make some hard political decisions. But I think that we need to recognize when we make those decisions that if we only look at COVID case curves or only look at COVID mortality rates, we're going to miss a lot. We're going to miss the suicide mortality. We're going to miss the heightened mortality of people not going in to get medical care that they need because they're afraid to go to the hospital. We're going to miss all kinds of other adverse effects
Yeah.
that are caused not directly by the vaccine, but caused by the choices that we make in the face of this pandemic. So in my view, it's time for a real public conversation about these policies. I'm glad you're hosting this conference. I imagine it's gonna challenge a lot of assumptions out there, and I think an open conversation like that is a good and healthy thing for us at
Mhm.
this stage. I think it's past due.
Yeah, I
Myself.
agree. I agree 100%. And open conversation might be a pretty good layman's synonym for the scientific method. An open conversation
That's right.
about competing hypotheses. I think people, Dr. Kheriaty, who are non-radical, non-activist types, they're living their lives, they're watching Dancing with the Stars, they miss Regis Philbin. But seeing doctors, researchers, and scientists not be refuted, but be banned, I think that has a whole new crop of people off the fence saying, wait a second, just refute them. What's this cancel culture on steroids when it comes to our lives? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that can only in the end undermine public trust in people that hold themselves up as experts
Mm-hmm.
in this area. I mean, we can start with the fact that the narrative, the World Health Organization, CDC, what have you, narrative that's apparently not banned on YouTube or other platforms,
Mm-hmm.
that narrative itself has changed over time. I mean, the experts have radically flip-flopped in the face of new information or other motivations on masks, for example. I mean, it was not that long ago that administrators at hospitals were chastising nurses who wanted to wear masks to work and telling them, this is overboard and you're being hysterical and this is. and then a month later,
Mhm.
you're getting chastised if you're not wearing a mask at work, or if you're not
Yeah.
wearing it properly, or what have you. So when you're told, listen to the experts, and the expert opinion keeps changing, that undermines trust. And it's not so much that, look, with a new pandemic that's unfolding, it's not surprising that expert opinion might change, because we're learning as we go, right? That's not in and of itself a problem. The problem comes in when dissenting voices from the so-called consensus are not allowed to be heard, because, as you
Mhm.
pointed out earlier, that's how science advances. It doesn't advance by just adhering to old orthodoxies. It advances by conjecturing things and admitting that they're falsifiable, and then actually working to falsify them,
Yeah.
right? And if you can't falsify a hypothesis, it gains in credibility and it gains in strength. But nothing in science is ever fully settled,
Yeah.
right? We thought Newtonian physics was fully settled for a couple hundred years, and then it was upended by Einstein's theory of general relativity. So people who actually understand how science works don't want there to be just a single so-called scientific orthodoxy
Mhm.
that's allowed to be discussed publicly, because um, that's not good for science. It's not good for medicine. It's not good for a democratic regime of self-governance. Um, our leaders need to trust ordinary citizens enough. Um, and it's the era of fake news. I suppose it's maybe hard to do that. It's a little bit of a leap of faith, but to trust that the ordinary person can sift information, and draw conclusions, and behave responsibly. I mean, the fact is, social distancing and people staying at home was happening already before it was mandated
Well,
by the
don't
government.
people do this
Uh,
naturally? Every flu season, doesn't this happen? Nope, not going to get on the plane. I got the flu. Nope, I'm going to stay home. Don't hug me. I got the flu. We naturally do this.
yep.
Um, Last month, I interviewed tenured professor at USC, Dr. Joel Hay, and he's done a study of the case mortality rate inside prisons. It's actually lower in prison. Now, why is that? They're in there cheek by jowl, because they naturally social distance. If it's up to them, they're going to police their own. Pardon the metaphor. They're going to police their own space, right? Their own sphere,
Right.
which is exactly counter to what our governor has said, which is why he released 8,000 criminals because COVID. It's maddening.
Well, the other thing that we need is more individualized risk assessment, or maybe population-based risk assessment. And what I mean by that is, look, I've already had COVID. My whole family had COVID. My wife,
Mm-hmm.
5 kids, had COVID. Um, Not to trivialize COVID, but in our case, it wasn't that bad. I know, obviously, for a small proportion of people, it could be much worse. But I am now at very low risk
Yeah.
of harm from COVID, right? There's some reports that maybe you can get it twice if you get a different strain of it, but the second case is going to be very mild compared to the first. The fact that my first case was mild, I'm not concerned about this, and I think it's entirely reasonable for me not to be concerned
Yeah.
um, uh,
So
about this. But the population of the local nursing home should be concerned
mhm.
about this. So why aren't we doing more to protect those folks, to give them what they need, to make sure that they're safe, put the resources in to strictly monitor everything that goes in and out of there, maybe hire people that have acquired the virus and recovered from it to work there,
How about take them outside?
whatever.
Take them out. How
Let's
about take
protect
them
those folks.
outside? Take them to the park. If sunlight kills COVID, let's kill some COVID, man. No, lock down,
Yeah.
shut the lights. They're already vulnerable and frail and probably frightened. So let me ask you this: were you honestly? I don't want to put you on the spot. Were you nervous to learn that you and your family had COVID-19? Did you think we got the dreaded thing? Was there like a heart skipping a beat
No.
thing, or were you just completely
No, I was
cool as a cucumber?
Yeah, I
'Cause
was
I would
more
be nervous.
annoyed that. Yeah, no, I wasn't. Honestly, I wasn't really nervous. I was concerned about getting COVID before I got it, mostly because, at the time there was a lot of talk about asymptomatic transmission,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't want to transmit it to my family, but I also didn't, probably more importantly, I didn't want to transmit it to vulnerable patients at the hospital, right? Because I'm doing rounds on the psych consult service, in the ICU, in the ER. I'm seeing patients that are very sick.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those patients are in confined settings like our inpatient psychiatry unit. And, I didn't want to put those patients at risk. I'm fully aware that there are populations that are at higher risk for adverse outcomes with COVID. And I happen to be in contact with a lot of those folks just because I'm a physician.
Yep.
So that was my main concern. I don't want to be a vector for transmission for people that really could be harmed about it. When I recognized that I was coming down with symptoms and I knew where I had been exposed to it, it was more like I was annoyed because I knew I'd have to be out of work for the next 10 days. And I holed up in my room and tried to distance from my family. At that point, they had already been exposed. So they ended up all getting it too. And, they got very mild cases.
Right.
But was I worried that I was going to go into respiratory distress and have to go to the hospital or be put on a ventilator?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'd seen the numbers. And, in my opinion, my chances of getting seriously injured on my 25-mile commute to work by getting in a motor vehicle accident are probably higher than my chances of being seriously injured by this virus. So I'm a doctor. I can think statistically. I wasn't laying in bed worried that I'm going to stop breathing tonight and have to go to the hospital.
Right. You were just worried about not having to lose to chess in a game of chess with one of your kids. That's gotta hurt.
Yeah, there's that. There's it was lonely being locked up in my room for 10 days and not being able to interact with my family. But I was working from home, so to speak, for much of that time, getting some writing and some administrative work done. So really 48 hours of flu-like symptoms, followed by another 8 days of just, staying quarantined.
And it's not good for the men to be alone. That must have been a little window onto the true trial that old people who are already lonely, who already have family members who've stopped going regularly. What about the divorce rate, Dr. Kheriaty? Is that seen a spike as well, to your knowledge? Marital strife and divorces ending, marriages ending?
So I've seen data on, the short answer is I don't know. I have seen data that suggests domestic violence is going up. People are holed up under stressful circumstances. They can't establish some distance, from their partner. If they had problems that were brewing in that regard, they've been exacerbated. So child abuse and spousal abuse has gone up. What I anticipate is as things reopen, we may see more people filing for divorce at that point. I think during the lockdowns, people are just trying to get through it. They're not necessarily taking steps in that direction. But I would not be surprised if in the 6 months to a year following kind of things really opening up and us going back to more routine lives, if we saw that this harmed a lot of marriages and we began to see the divorce numbers rising. That may be happening already in some places. I don't know. I just haven't kept up on the divorce data recently. But it's a great question. And given the other mental health effects that we've seen and the other behavioral effects that we've seen, I would be surprised if this didn't have some kind of adverse effect on marriages as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. For now, people are cocooning. They're in. Let's get through this tomorrow and the next day and the next day.
Yeah, they're hunkered down and exactly.
I wonder if this is lends truth to the adage that a crisis doesn't forge character; it reveals it.
We've seen a lot of that during this crisis. It's interesting. One of my colleagues at work mentioned that. How did she describe it? Yeah, it was the difference between a boss and a leader. And a boss is someone who has some particular professional position and some title associated with it, and probably some power and authority in the organization because of that. And a leader is the person that people turn to in a crisis for help, or for strength, or for inspiration to get through it. And we saw a lot of that. I think the medical students and the residents at the School of Medicine and in our department were able to see who among the faculty, who among the deans is a true leader, and who among them is maybe not so good in a crisis, or is taking care of themselves and not looking out for the needs of others. And I imagine in other professional settings or other familial settings, those kind of distinctions of character were probably revealed, especially in the beginning when no one knew what was going on. We really didn't have a good handle on this virus. The models and the numbers for mortality were looking really bad. That was a scary period, I think, for everybody. And how people responded to that, I think, showed a lot about what they're made of.
It's a good distinction between leader and boss. I was thinking, boss is the one you have to follow. Leader's the one you want to follow.
Yeah, that's right. Excellent.
Soon after, I interviewed Dr. Joel Hay, who was talking about the relative non-lethal nature of novel coronavirus, COVID-19. Not that it can't kill anyone; it does, and it's not to be made light of, or you don't want to undermine the truth of it. And then within a day after the interview dropped, the CDC quietly revised their numbers, and at the time, this is mid-August, the 162,000 quote-unquote COVID deaths were readjusted, taking out pre-existent comorbidities. And I think the average additional health threat was 2.3 per patient. So people had galloping symptoms that were exacerbated by COVID-19. But the true mortality case rate, I believe, was 6%, which is at the time under 7,000. 7,000 is a very different number from 162,000. And this goes to your point about, well, they revise it. The problem is the earlier versions of what gets revised are sometimes very hard to find on social media. You can't find Dr. Fauci mocking masks as he did on 60 Minutes back in March. Good luck trying to find it. So it's put into the rabbit hole.
Well, yeah, Orwell called this the memory hole in 1984. Right. You remember that?
Yeah, sure.
The protagonist, the main character, his job is to sort of erase yesterday's news that doesn't comport with the party line. So I'm not saying that our leaders are kind of 1984 level, but when you start to see this sort of thing, it's cause for concern, right?
Yeah.
Look, it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to revise your opinions. I think more people should be open to that and to be able to say, I've changed my mind and revised my opinions in regards to COVID. And I haven't deleted any tweets. You can go back and look at my earlier tweets, and I was more strongly in favor of lockdowns at that time when we had less information and when we needed to flatten the curve. Now I'm much more skeptical that we need lockdowns at the level that we're currently seeing them in some states like California.
Yeah.
And I can explain how my thinking evolved. And look, that's okay. I mean, I would think it's a good thing to try to remain open-minded and change your mind about things. But what we don't want is for, especially people that are in a position of public authority where you're supposed to listen to them, to be able to erase your own paper trail or your own public messaging trail is it's mendacious. I mean, it's manipulative, in my opinion. It's an attempt. It's a kind of PR attempt to maintain a level of public credibility that your words may not warrant. And look, I think people are much more likely to trust a person who says, I changed my mind in the face of new evidence, and I've revised my thinking, and this is what I'm thinking now, than someone who pretends that they didn't say something a few months ago, and with a straight face just says precisely the opposite. this is the kind of thing that will undermine the public's trust. And if we get another pandemic that is much worse than this, it wouldn't take much in terms of the virulence and the case fatality rate. And you tweak these numbers a little bit, and we can get something that really is scary, right?
Yeah, God forbid actual Ebola rolls through.
That where people absolutely do need to take seriously, severe and strict measures, or there's going to be carnage. Mm-hmm. And if the leaders have squandered their public credibility during this pandemic, and they don't have it for a potential future pandemic that might be much worse, that's gonna cause a lot of damage, right?
Yes, 100%. I grew up in Nova Scotia, which is, I think I mentioned this to you off the air, population 972,000. Almost no cases. Curve is flattened a long, long time ago. The province of Nova Scotia is still cut off from the rest of Canada and the U.S. So if you go to any town or city in Nova Scotia, you're automatically assigned a mandatory 14-day quarantine in the residence of the vulnerable person that the government thinks they're protecting by having the quarantine. You can't make it up. It's just you can't parody this. And the police call you every day to make sure you're not being a grandma killer, being a good little sheep. And I think the overplaying of this police state mentality is waking a lot of people up. You see footage of the young woman, a 28-year-old pregnant mom in Melbourne, Australia, Zoe Bueller, arrested, facing 15 years in prison in the state of Victoria for what they call the crime of incitement, which was in reality a Facebook post relative to a lockdown protest in the streets of Melbourne. So the medicine has been weaponized by the state. That's what's different. This collusion of let's call it big science, the government and media all playing off the same sheet of music, protecting each other, making sure that memory hole works properly. In fact, you gave me an idea for my opening presentation at the Truth Over Fear conference and that the virtual summit, and that is that the internet itself was one giant Snapchat. Everything's deletable. Mm-hmm. There's a tentativeness and a kind of ephemeral quality to internet news, internet entertainment. Right. You can always say, unless you have access to a complicated Wayback Machine. That's different from print, where you can look it up in a book. You can't burn every book, but you can delete every file.
And this is not just on kind of mom and pop websites, but credible, the newspapers of record. We've seen this recently with the New York Times, and we've seen it recently with Newsweek. The New York Times quietly, without announcing a correction, usually, if we're going to revise something online, you have the little thing at the bottom, the earlier version of this
erratum.
This was incorrect. The news story published on such and such a date says this. Well, now that the major newspapers, New York Times, Newsweek, they're doing this without publishing the errata, without publishing the revisions or notifying the public of the revisions, so that the same story is now different, and there was no announcement of it. And so, you cite something, you hyperlink to it, and you make some sort of claim about it, and then the person goes to the hyperlink a month later, and then it accuses you of falsifying it because what was there a month ago is no longer there. I mean, it just creates all kinds of problems with credibility, and how do I believe?
Yeah.
So this is enormously irresponsible journalism.
Yep.
And it's where journalism begins to shade into propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Count the ironies if you can. One of the factors, I'm sure, feeding into this increased anxiety, loneliness, depression, suicidal ideation is the decision of many Christian pastors, and as a Catholic speaking to one, the decision of some of our bishops to even oppose governors who considered church attendance as an essential service. Bishops themselves saying, we're we're good. We want to follow the science and protect people. The fact that I can walk into my local grocery store and I can handle Brussels sprouts and lemons and carrots, no one cares. There's no masking, no gloves needed. I can walk into Costco or Walmart or wherever, Target, with 700 other people. You know, naturally social distancing, sometimes not so much. But going to church, you got to have a limit. You've got to have 50 or 12 or whatever it is. How much is the decision of the oligarchs to target churches for specific and rather low limits? How much is that feeding the darkness we're talking about during the lockdown?
That can only obviously increase the mistrust. It's one thing to listen to public health officials, even if you might disagree with them, but okay, I'll go along. If you feel that you're being treated fairly, you know, according to how everyone else is being treated. But, you know, I mean, the worst example of this is probably Mayor of San Francisco telling the Archbishop of San Francisco they can have only one person in an enormous cathedral at a time. One person. You know, this is obviously targeting a house of worship and places of worship, but elsewhere in California, the number of people that are allowed in a church of a specific size, you know, is far, far lower than the number of people allowed in comparable other public spaces of the same size. So, I mean, what can you say about that? You know, I guess the only thing the thing I would want to tell our bishops, if any of them are listening, is that the lay faithful need the sacraments, right? And that's one thing that you have to insist upon, right? Yeah, and you have the authority to do that. The Thomistic Institute has published guidelines for how you can administer sacraments to the sacrament of the sick, for example, without spreading coronavirus.
Sure.
So Catholic faithful should not be dying in a hospital without a priest, without the sacraments. And certainly the lay faithful should have somewhere to go on Sunday and really every day to attend the Holy Mass and receive communion. And if something's getting, you know, it's one thing if people stay away because they're making the decision to do that, but if people want to go to Mass and there's none available, that's a serious problem. There are ways to do this. It's been demonstrated that there are ways to do this safely. And, you know, at a certain point, if we're being treated differently than a business or, you know, another public space, the response has to be a kind of collective, you know, we're gonna take what you say under advisement, but, you know, we're responsible for the administration of the sacraments, and you know, we'll take precautions and we'll be reasonable, but there is a First Amendment right to the free expression of religion here, and the faithful cannot be restricted in such a way that they're not able to receive the Catholic sacraments.
The Council of Trent dogmatically defined that the sacraments are necessary for salvation. There can be no new normal for Catholics watching Zoom masses. It's not the same thing. You're watching thousands of pixelated light images. It's not really the Eucharist on the screen there. I think the San Francisco limit was 12 inside, which is about 1% of the cathedral's capacity. So an idea, if Archbishop Corleone's listening, whom I've interviewed and respect, if he issued a press release or put it on Twitter that he's going to invite 13 minimum to come. I mean, bring the fight there. I mean, look at Pastor John MacArthur of Grace Community Church, a man who doesn't understand sacraments as we do, and he's suing the governor and the mayor of LA and the attorney general. That's a fighting spirit that when Christians hear it, they go, okay, there's a leader. This is not a boss. This is a leader. Harken back to what we said earlier.
Yeah. At a certain point, you know, free people needs to stand up for certain rights. You know, they can't demand unreasonable things that would harm others, but I think what we're seeing now is a pretty clear form of religious discrimination that Catholics and other Christians and other people of faith cannot and should not accept.
Yep. One of the presenters at the Truth Over Fear Summit is Michael Fumento, who's now in the Philippines. And he writes about the fact that a few months ago, I forget the exact data tipping point, that more people have died not because of COVID-19, but because of being sidelined, put in a different area of the triage, prioritizing. And now more people have died as a result of our collective willingness to burn the house down in order to kill a termite than were killed by the termite.
I don't know the answer to that question with certainty. I'm not sure anyone does. I mean, there are 1,000 imponderables here that are really hard to measure. And, I tend to not want to make public claims unless I have hard data. I suspect, so as not to dodge your question entirely, I suspect that the damage from our collective decisions is much larger than anyone realizes. And it would not surprise me if the mortality that we've caused from these collective decisions exceeds the mortality that we've prevented or the mortality that has been caused by COVID.
Yep.
Right. So there's two benchmarks there of comparison. Yeah. How many lives did we save by doing this? I don't know that anyone knows that with any degree of certainty. It's impossible to know. It depends on your model. And, with any model, garbage in, garbage out.
Sure.
How many people have died of COVID? We can get closer to that number, though, as you've already pointed out, that number is actually hard to get at, too, since many people who had COVID, though did not necessarily die of COVID, may have been coded on their death certificate as.
Has challenged that. The coding on death certificates is a whole other politicized thing. This is an odd feature of this pandemic, isn't it? Everything's politicized. Some people in the scroll are asking about hydroxychloroquine and zinc. That's a different topic for a different day. Mask efficacy, different topic for a different day. But this is the first politicized illness, isn't it? Everything's seen through Biden-Trump lens.
I would say it's the illness that's been politicized to the most extreme degree. There's no doubt about that. I mean, other illnesses have been politicized. One can think of HIV/AIDS, for example.
That's true.
But and perhaps to some degree other sexually transmitted infections. But certainly we have this strange phenomenon, which did not happen with HIV/AIDS. I mean, nobody decided whether a particular antiretroviral for AIDS was efficacious or not based on their political party affiliation, right? This is really weird. And, I've looked at some of the data on hydroxychloroquine. I suspect that it has some efficacy, probably not as much as some people claim for it, but certainly more than other people claim for it. With that said, I'm not an expert on the medication, but what I can say is probably the worst thing that happened to that medication is that, Donald Trump said that he liked it or that he was using it or whatever. And then suddenly it became this weirdly politicized question about whether or not this medication was effective. So much so that the Lancet, major medical journal, published a piece and probably rushed to publication, a crazy piece, ended up turning out to be entirely fraudulent.
Connecting it to cardiac issues?
No, this was another one showing basically that it didn't work, lack of efficacy. It wasn't so much about side effects as it was about, we've got a bunch of data now, international, from all these different medical centers, that shows that it's no more effective than placebo or whatever. And they had to issue a very embarrassing retraction because it turns out that the so-called research group that put together this massive database, well, the database didn't even exist. People started asking questions right away about how do these people have access to all this data? Where did this come from? This huge hospital network. We've never heard of this.
It was huge.
Well,
it was huge.
It was huge. It was like a couple of hustlers, like one former porn actress and some physician that had lost his license, that basically made
Right.
all these numbers up.
Yeah.
And with a little bit of vetting, this could have been found out. And why did this thing ever get published in a very well regarded peer reviewed medical
Yeah.
journal? Well, it's because the whole thing had become politicized and people were waiting, either, depending on what side of the debate you're on, either for data that it was the miracle cure, or for
Yeah.
data, Trump's a genius, or data that, Trump's an idiot. And this, well, I mean,
Right.
as soon as a question like that becomes politicized, it's probably difficult, if not impossible, to get real answers.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, of course, with everything that the president says or does, it's always a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he turned to a drug which is morally neutral. It's a being, it's a thing, into a political hot potato. On the other hand, it sent millions of otherwise ignorant people to want to find out more about it. So, double-edged sword. On the back of all this, Aaron, on the back of, beneath all of the anxiety, all of the well-meaning messaging that's often couched in love bomb terms, take care of yourself. Now, instead of see you later, it's stay safe. How much of that messaging is a basic, good old-fashioned fear of death?
Well, it's natural for human beings to fear death. Death was not part of the original plan. And our Lord experienced anxiety when facing his own passion and death.
Mm-hmm.
But Christians also understand that death is not the end, and to the point where St. Paul could sort of mock death. Where is thy sting? For a pagan to say something like that would have been absolutely ludicrous,
right?
Madness. But when you've lost faith in eternal life, this life becomes your sole horizon of meaning, then death is going to be terrifying in a way that it ought not to be. And health is going to become the highest human good. Right. Health is clearly a human good. All of us want to be healthy rather than sick, obviously.
Yep.
We want to do what we can to eradicate and minimize illness, obviously. But, we also know that we're broken and that nature is cracked down the middle, and that we're never going to completely eradicate disease. We're never going to completely overcome death by technological means. But there is this fantasy, you see it in living color in the transhumanist movement. But there is also a fantasy nurtured by many ordinary people that medicine, if it doesn't have the answers, it's going to find the answers soon. And there's a kind of unreasonable insistence and demand that medicine fix something, such that if it doesn't, that's kind of a politically and socially intolerable situation. What do I mean by that? I mean, I think everyone is anticipating that science is going to come up with a vaccine that's going to cure this and eradicate it permanently.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a good chance that won't happen. I hope we eradicate it. I really do. But I don't know that we will. And I do know that expecting that we will, or demanding that we will, is not reasonable. We can hope, we can pray, we can hope for the best. But this idea that science can solve all of our problems, and that there's a technological fix or cure for everything, including sickness and death, is a complete fantasy. It's really a psychotic loss of touch with reality, if I can just put my psychiatrist hat on for a moment. That is not the case. That's never going to be the case, despite the transhumanist dreams and utopian delusions. So I'm a physician. I love science. I'm a supporter of technology where it's helpful and conducive to human flourishing. I'm glad that we've made progress on treating coronavirus. I'm glad that the case fatality rate is going down. We're getting better at treating the severe cases in the ICU. Of course. But I also have no illusions about science and medicine, because I see patients all the time that walk into our hospital with unrealistic expectations. I was talking to a bioethicist who came to give a lecture at Irvine. She was from Hopkins. She was talking about, difficult conversations at the end of life when families are having a hard time accepting that their loved one has reached the end stage. There's nothing more that medicine can do, which is always the case for everyone eventually, right?
That case rate's 100%.
Yeah. The mortality rate is holding steady at 100% in spite of all the advances, right? But she said, look, the marketing at Hopkins is not helpful because the tagline is, the place where miracles happen.
Yeah, bingo.
Which is religious language, right?
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Looking to science, technology, and medicine as a kind of source of religious salvation or eternal life. When you put it in those stark terms, people will say, no, okay, I understand, I'm going to die. But this kind of marketing, this kind of meme, this kind of attitude that's very prevalent in the culture, I think influences us in all kinds of unconscious ways.
That makes sense.
To demand more, to expect more from science and medicine than we're capable of delivering. And a lot of that probably has to do with a loss of faith in a broader horizon, loss of faith in the transcendent that allows us to recognize that bodily life is a great good, bodily health is a great good, but it's not the ultimate good.
Yeah, that miracles happen, unrealistic expectations of doctors and medicines kind of taps into this. Maybe it's another feature of our fallen human nature. We want utopia. We want the heaven on earth now. We want the kingdom of God yesterday. Sort of almost tapping into a fountain of youthish impulse where we low tolerance for imperfection.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is an old story. This is nothing new. Humankind has been searching for this for ages. You can see it in the old myths. You can see it in the old fairy tales. The El Dorado stories, and this kind of perennial human aspiration, which is a religious aspiration, I would suggest, and can only be fulfilled by the God who reveals himself in Jesus Christ. And when that religious aspiration doesn't find rest in Christ Jesus and his promises, it's not eradicated from the human heart.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, on the one hand, I can maybe criticize and try to bring people back to reality who are putting too much faith in technology and progress. But on the other hand, if you don't have faith in God, then those religious aspirations have to find some fulfillment somewhere. And so people creating false gods or idols or creating a religion out of this or that they find in the world is not really all that surprising.
I've been thinking a lot about light. Our Lord calls himself the light. I am the light of the world. And this lockdown has induced hundreds of millions of people to look at a form of light that's not real. The glowing screen of their TV, of their internet. It's a kind of light, but it's faux light. It's not the sun. But it's a reasonable facsimile, so people are kind of drawn to it whereas worship of the Father is free, it's non-compelled. It's the highest good that you want. It gives you joy, versus the compulsivity aspect to the fear of missing out. All designed by intention, right? The sound of the Facebook notification, the ping, the satisfying click sounds of social media are designed to have us to go back again and again and again. Yep. And then we become more vulnerable to messaging. I just realized, my gosh, we've gone an hour and 20 minutes already, super fast. I wanted to ask you, maybe by way of thanking you and wrapping up, if people should take some comfort in the fact that the early hysterical Chicken Little numbers, whether it's the Neil Ferguson 2.2 million, none of those, Austin Powers wild over-exaggerations came true. They were all absurdly overwrought and inaccurate. And here we are at the tail end. I mean, we are facing a flu season, which might get rebranded as the second wave. I don't know. Maybe everybody who's got a sniffle is going to be diagnosed. But just speak to the statistical reality that the experts, capital E, were wrong about how bad it would be.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's the initial catastrophic anticipations have not been borne out. We have a pretty good handle on this now. Every death is sad. Every death is a tragedy. But we don't turn on our TV screen and see every death on the freeway.
Right.
By the way, motor vehicle accidents and death through motor vehicle accident and total mortality rate went down initially during the lockdown very significantly, right? So we saved a lot of other lives in other ways. So it's not to trivialize the loss of life or anyone who's died of COVID or lost a loved one. I don't want to suggest that. But you're right. The original kind of apocalyptic catastrophe numbers have not been borne out. And I would say, just by way of closing, anyone in the audience who may be struggling, maybe you have a loved one that's struggling with some of the things that I talked about today, the depression, the anxiety, the feeling like I can't go on anymore, just to remember that help is available. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. Lots of folks are reaching out for help now that maybe didn't need help for mental health issues in the past. And lots of clinics like our own at UCI are doing telemedicine. So you can see a mental health professional via Zoom. And, don't be afraid to get help. And the one thing that you can do to probably help yourself, going back to your comment about the screens, is I suggest do a 2-week total fast from screens, right? From your phone, from your computer, from your television. Get up in the morning at a fixed time, go outside, see the sun, go for a walk, smell the smells, hear the birds, get away from the doom scrolling, the constant barrage of, the world is going to come to an end in November. The constant barrage of causing you to fret about things over which you have no control. You do have control over things in your life. Remember that. Turn off the screen for a couple of weeks. Take my advice and see how you feel in 2 weeks. Just do a little experiment. I think you'll find that that health and mental health benefits are going to be remarkably profound. So thanks, Patrick, for having me on for this opportunity to talk about these important issues.
No problem. You can follow Dr. Aaron Kheriaty on Twitter. He's pretty active there. It's Kheriaty, Aaron with 2 A's. AaronKheriaty.com is his website. You can see his articles and essays and a bio and lots of content there. And all of it has one thing in common. It's all free. We love free around here. Awesome. Look forward to your presentation at the upcoming Truth Over Fear Summit. The website's about to launch, and I'm so honored that people like you, Dr. Kheriaty, jumped on board before the thing had a name, before the thing had a date. People are hungry for the truth, and they want alternative, different ways of looking at the same phenomenon. So thanks for being part of that conversation and that open discussion, and appreciate your time. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks, Patrick.
All right, this has been a live stream hangout. We do this every month. Inside Coffin Nation, we do it every week. It's called Ask Away Thursdays. Check out coffinnation.com. Might be for you. Find out what folks in 25 countries are enjoying at this very moment. In the meantime, be a saint.